We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Bezom and Bezom Meseches Nedarim. This is Nedarim Daf 42b. And the previous Amud, the Gemara is quoting a Mishnah. The Mishnah says if a person prohibits property to his son, so then it's only prohibited during the father's lifetime. But if the father dies, so then the property is going to be permitted and the son will inherit. However, if the way the father phrases the neder, he says that you're prohibited during my lifetime and after death, so then the halacha is im meis. If the father dies, lo yirashenu, he's not allowed to inherit him. In any case, the Gemara says you see clearly from this Mishnah that a person is able to prohibit something that's in his reshus, and it's going to be prohibited even after it leaves his reshus. Even after the father dies, the prohibition is still in effect. So how can we say, we said on the previous Amud, that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish say ein adam oser, that a person is not allowed to prohibit something that's in his reshus. The prohibition will not continue after it leaves his reshus. And the Gemara answers, Shani Hacha, no, it's different over here in this Mishnah. Because there, in the Mishnah, the father specifically said it's prohibited during his lifetime and after his death, and that's why the prohibition remains in effect even after his death, and therefore there is no proof from the Mishnah. But the Gemara says, Mikol Makom Kasha, but nevertheless, it is difficult. The first question we asked on this explanation, the issue is again on the previous Amud. The case that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish were talking about is when a person says, my property is prohibited to you. So in that situation, we say that after it leaves the person's reshus, it's not going to be prohibited. But that would imply that it's only because the person said, my property. So when it leaves his reshus, it's no longer considered his property. But by nechasim elu, if a person just says, this property, it sounds like Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, it sounds like they would have said that it is prohibited even after it leaves his reshus. So therefore it sounds like Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish do say that a person can prohibit the property when it's in his reshus, even for a time when it leaves his reshus. And so therefore the Gemara says you're right. Ella rather, b'nechasim elu kuli alma lo pligi. If a person phrases it that this property is prohibited to you, so there is no argument. Everyone agrees, meaning Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, they all agree that the prohibition will remain in effect even after it leaves his reshus, because the way it was phrased was nechasim elu, this property. It is still the same property after it leaves his reshus. Ki pligi b'nechasai. The whole machlokas amoraim is when the phrasing of the neder is my property is going to be prohibited. And the Gemara explains, Rav Shmuel Savri, in that case, Rav and Shmuel, they hold, Loshna nechasim elu, Loshna nechasai. It doesn't matter if the phrasing is this property or the phrasing is my property is prohibited to you. In all of those situations, Adam Oser, a person is able to create the prohibition, and the prohibition will remain in effect even when it's no longer in his reshus. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish Savri and Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, they hold, Nechasim Adam Oser. If a person says Nechasim elu, so then the prohibition will remain in effect even after it's not in his reshus. Nechasai, but if a person says my property, ein adam oser, so then the prohibition will not remain in effect when it is not in his reshus, because it's no longer considered his property. But the Gemara continues, but is there anyone who says that there is no difference between nechasim elu and nechasai, meaning to say, is there anyone who would agree with the position over here that we're saying of Rav and Shmuel, that even when a person says nechasai, it is still going to be prohibited after it leaves his reshus? That is not true either. But we learned in a Mishnah, if a person says to his friend, konem l'soch beischa shani nichnas, there's a konem to your house that I will not enter your house. He's making a neder that he's not going to enter the other individual's house, or sadcha shani lokeach, or your field that I will purchase. Again, the person's making a neder not to purchase the other individual's field. So in that situation, mace, if the person dies, or he sells the property of somebody else, so it's no longer his property, it's no longer his house or his field, so mutter, so in that situation, it is going to be mutter. It's no longer beischa, it's no longer sadcha. But if the phrasing is labayis zeh shani nichnas, this house I'm not going to enter, sadazu shani lokech, or this house I'm not going to purchase, so in that case the phrasing was this house, this field, so then, if the person dies, or he sells it to somebody else, aser, it will be prohibited. So it seems from this Mishnah that everybody would agree, or we should say from this Mishnah that everybody would agree, that by nechasim elu, the prohibition does remain in effect even after it's no longer in the person's reshus. And the Gemara says you are correct to that as well. Ella rather ki amri Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish b'nechasai. When do Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish say the prohibition is no longer in effect? That's only if it was phrased as nechasai. V'Rav u'Shmuel b'nechasim elu, and Rav and Shmuel, they're the ones that say the prohibition when it's phrased as nechasim elu v'lo pligi. And in reality, Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, and Rav and Shmuel, they were not arguing at all. Everybody agrees to everything. Everybody agrees that by nechasim elu the prohibition does remain in effect, and everybody agrees by nechasai that the prohibition does not remain in effect. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "Uvashvius, if the neder is made during the Shemitah year, so ein yored l'soch sadeh v'chulu, so there's still going to be a prohibition of drisas haregel. The person can't enter into the field, but he is allowed to take from the produce. Let's say the produce that's hanging outside of the field, that's considered hefker, and it is not prohibited." And so the Gemara now asks, "Ma'ishna da'ochel min hanotos?" What's the difference that he's allowed to eat from the fruit that is hanging outside of the field? To peri de hefker, because that's considered again fruits of hefker, and therefore it's considered to be mutter. The peri de hefkerin, and those are peros of hefker, and there is no prohibition. But aronami hefker. But the halacha is that during the Shemitah year, the land is also hefker, so drisas haregel should also be permitted. Why is that not allowed when the neder is made during the Shemitah year? And the Gemara says, Amar Ula says, Ba'omdin ilanos al hagvulim. We're talking about a situation where the trees are on the border of the property. We'll see the Mefarish in a moment. Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim Amar, Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim says, Gezerah shema yisha ba'amida. The only reason he cannot enter into the property is a gezerah that maybe he's going to delay, he's going to stay there longer than necessary, and that actually would be a problem. The land is not considered hefker in that regard. And the Mefarish over here explains, that we're talking about a case when he takes from the fruits. Again, they're hanging at the boundary, at the border of the property, and therefore he's able to take those fruits mibachutz while he's still outside the property. Mishomachi eino yored, and that's the reason why he can't go into the property. Why? Isn't the land hefker? No, says the Mefarish. When the Torah says that the person's property is hefker during the Shemitah year, letzorech achila, that's only true, it's only hefker if the person, the other individual, is going into the property for the purpose of eating the produce. It's made hefker for that purpose. But if the fruit that the person is taking, you don't need to go into the property, the land is not considered hefker in that regard. In other words, it's not across the board. The land is not always considered hefker during Shemitah year. It's not like anyone can enter into your property. They're only allowed to enter into the property for the purpose of eating, and therefore, again, the case of the Mishnah is there's no need to enter the property for the purpose of eating, and that's why that is prohibited. And the Mefarish continues, Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim Amar Hada Katani Ochel Min Hanotos, when it says again that a person is allowed to eat from the hanging fruit, Vadai Kidduka Amrit, certainly it is what you said. Can go into Omdin ala Gvulin, where we're talking about where it is on the boundary, Mishum Sheyachol Hoshad Yadav Likach Mibachutz, since he could take it from the outside, that's why he's not allowed to go into the property. Avol Ein Omdin ala Gvulin, Eino Yord L'Soch Sadeo. But again, let's say it would not be within the property, so then actually, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim, you can't go into the property to get the fruit. The Asr lo leired l'sham, it is actually Asr to go in and get the fruit, even though he really does need to go in order to get the fruit, and therefore shouldn't the land be hefker? Why is that a problem if it's not on the boundary? And the reason is because of a gezerah. Gezerah shema yisha ba'amida, like Rav Shimon ben Eliakim says, you're never allowed to go into the property because we're afraid you're going to stay in the property longer than necessary. The la'achar sha'achal omid lo l'sham, after he eats, he's going to stand there. The kamisani minachasim the matter, he's going to end up getting property benefit from the property of the madir, which is not allowed. The asr, that's prohibited. Again, the haida afkre rachmana calls manshu ochel. Like we said before, the property is only hefker while he's eating. Az yachol amod l'sham, then he can stand there. The hefker, it's considered hefker. Avol shelo l'tzorach achila lo afkre. But if it's not l'tzorach achila, he did not make it hefker. So according to Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim, even if you're going to go into, in a case of a mudar hana, even to go into the property for the purpose of eating is a problem, because even though it is hefker, if you're going in for the purpose of eating, we're afraid the person is going to stay there longer than necessary. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Hamudar Hanam Mechaver, you have a situation where a person's not allowed to get benefit from his friend, so Lo Yashi Lenu v'lo Yishal Mimenu, he can't lend him and he can't borrow from him. Lo Yalvenu v'lo Yilva Mimenu, he cannot lend to him, that's talking about money, he cannot borrow from him. V'lo Yimchor Lo v'lo Yikach Mimenu, he cannot sell to him and he cannot purchase from him. And the Mefarish says, Hamudar Hanam Mechaver Lo Yasha Lo She'ela B'Kelim. When we use the word She'ela, which is a kind of borrowing, that means when you borrow a person's kli, you borrow a person's item, and halva b'mos, the word halva is also borrowing, but that's referring to borrowing money, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Gimel Amud Aleph.